The Aurelian armada arrived above the blue world with the bored confidence of butchers. On their flagship, High Strategos Erix studied a rotating globe and declared the planet indecisive, divided, defenseless. He smiled at the absence of orbital fortresses, the cacophony of competing languages, the petty military drills below. "We will take them gently," he told his council. "They will thank us for order." He was wrong, and history fit the lesson into 52 seconds. From the flagship crown of ashes, Strategos Erix reviewed 3 cycles of scout footage. The planet they called Earth looked unthreatening, clouds like spilled milk, swaths of ocean like polished steel. Reports agreed with each other in the infuriating way that makes bad intelligence feel precise. 200 political partitions, routine border skirmishes, antiquated rockets, a thin scatter of satellites that looked like commercial junk. Their missiles were tall museum pieces. Their navies paraded for cameras and budgets, a ritual of steel and fuel more theatrical than lethal. Category 3 intoned the analysis choir, capable of labor, incapable of strategic surprise. The choir fed him charts, literacy rates, gross outputs, fuel tonnages, an argument disguised as a spreadsheet. They highlighted the absence of station fortresses, the lack of deep space anchors, the tragic comedy of independent launch schedules. They noted a fascination with sports and celebrity trials. In the margins of one brief, a junior analyst had drawn a crown over the Earth and labeled it ours. Erix approved the standard pacification ritual. Issue a formal ultimatum, demonstrate orbital fire on an expendable target, accept surrender, and install prefects before dusk. To prove he was humane, he selected an uninhabited atoll as the demonstration site. It would boil spectacularly and harm no one. Mercy, too, was propaganda. The armada dropped into the outer system with the confidence of a hammer that had never met a screw. As their arrival bled into every terrestrial telescope, the ultimatum rippled across every human frequency. Translated into hundreds of tongues, it promised safety in exchange for obedience. On the tactical map, Earth flickered, then something unsettling happened. The planet grew quiet, not silent, never silent. Weather beacons still murmured. Air traffic vectors breathed in neat triangles. Maritime safety bands ticked like heart monitors. But the noisy chorus between governments thinned to disciplined whispers. The chatter of rival staffs compressed into terse numerals. Even entertainment channels switched to test patterns and solemn music. The choir marked it as fear paralysis. Erix labeled it acceptance. Both labels felt tidy in the hand, like pre-sharpened knives. The scouts tracked movement that also felt wrong. Instead of massing armor near beaches and bases, ground forces dissolved into back roads and tree lines. Bombers dispersed to short, rugged runways. Submarines slid away from familiar patrol boxes. Tankers and cargo ships scattered to innocuous commercial lanes that made them indistinguishable from civilian traffic. Highway cams showed convoys of nothing in particular: refrigerated trucks, cement mixers, maintenance vans, rolling toward coordinates that looked like warehouses and maintenance depots rather than forts or launch pads. Power grids sagged then leveled, a swallow of current going somewhere the scouts could not name. City centers dimmed by a measurable fraction. Amateur astronomers reported new stars at twilight that were not where stars belonged. A university observatory in the Andes sent a panicked open letter about odd speckle patterns in the ionosphere. The choir flagged it for humor and archived it in a folder labeled Overeducated. The planet's military didn't bristle, it unknotted. Erix mistook the untying for unraveling. They are hiding their toys, he told his captains, four throats harmonizing in approval. We will swat a wave at the atoll and end this theater. He raised his hand for the demonstration strike and paused. A single spike scratched the sensor glass. Then two. Then dozens, hundreds from deserts, forests, iced bays, anonymous lots between shopping centers. Launch plumes should have bloomed into throats of fire. Instead, the tracks appeared cold and thin, like pencil marks drawn across the upper air. Acceleration curves were wrong, far too smooth for chemical rockets, too modest for exotic drives. Guidance was wrong, no drunken arcs, only ruthless lines punching toward altitude with accountant honesty. Primitive kinetics, said the weapons prelate, indulgent. Our shields will hold, Erix finished, though he watched the geometry with a new ache. The missiles did not climb as much as they arrived, inserted by equations that wasted nothing. Their numbers were not a barrage, they were a proof. The choir requested permission to broadcast the second message, an offer of clinics, food, jobs. Erix opened his mandibles to grant it. A human face appeared on the main screen uninvited. A woman in a plain dark uniform with no jewels, only responsibility. The translator rendered her name as Admiral Maya Sterling. Aurelian vessels, she said, steady as a level horizon. This is United Earth Defense Command. Cease hostile action and exit our sky. You have 30 seconds. United, the choir scoffed. Their archives show no planetary government. On the navigation rim, the countdown clock turned a corner and began to eat the future by single glowing integers. Erix lifted his hand again. Fire on the atoll, he ordered softly, to demonstrate that the future still belonged to him. Somewhere over the equator, a freight barge that had always been a freight barge dimmed its running lights. In a soy field in Iowa, a door in the earth rolled back like a tongue. In the Black Sea, a boy winked to a satellite that stopped pretending to be a satellite. The first impact arrived like a punctuation mark at the end of a lie. A tungsten rod the length of a man touched the vigil of ember and wrote a straight line through its shield harmonics, hull lattice, crew compartments, and reactor throat. No flare, no noble duel of beams, just a snap, a mechanical decision resolved at 12 thousandths of light speed. The dreadnought folded as if it had been designed to practice dying. Shields are permeated, cried the prelate, which was a ceremonial way of saying nothing helps. The second, third, fourth strikes landed not in salvos but in a cadence, downbeats separated by fractions of a heartbeat, as if an invisible percussionist knew the weak rhythm of Aurelian engineering. The missiles did not bloom plasma nor paint the sky with wasteful fire. They whispered. They adjusted by microns. They slid through defensive grids that had saved the Empire for a century, because those grids had been tuned to light and heat, not mass and intention. When Erix ordered a scatter, the constellation of capital ships broke into panic geometry. The tracks bending toward them bent smoothly with them, like a teacher following a child who had run out of hallway. Where are they coming from? The choir demanded, stripped now of choral calm. Sensor officers zoomed until continents became counties, until counties became roofs. What the scouts had logged as weather radar farms now resurfaced as horizon-skimming rail batteries fused to granite. What had been cataloged as communications satellites betrayed hidden apertures and recoil trusses. Parks became doors opening. Oil platforms sprouted crowns and spat silent meteors. The ocean itself coughed torpedoes the length of school buses that never bothered with bubbles. 20 seconds, said Admiral Sterling, returning to the main display. That is not a threat, it is a courtesy. Primitive, Erix insisted, and then he saw the math. The projectiles were not brilliant because they were novel, they were brilliant because they were honest. Electromagnetic rails fed by fusion barges, ceramic bearings that laughed at heat, targeting solved as simple, cruel geometry across a sky their ancestors had mapped with sextants. No shimmering fields to be spoofed, no photons to be redirected, no waste to be seen. If an Aurelian ship occupied coordinate X at time t, then a human slug occupied X plus epsilon at T plus delta, and physics signed the receipt. The 15th strike cut a command carrier into two tidy halves. The 20th caught a cruiser and used the glowing tunnel as a wind instrument. Someone on the bridge began to pray to an unapproved god. Erix shut down external audio. Pride survived longer that way. 10 seconds, Sterling said. No gloat, no tremor. A naval officer reciting a schedule. Beams came next, though the imperial textbooks swore beams could not behave like this through air. Pillars of coherent particles lanced out of valleys and offshore towers, drawn by adaptive optics that made weather irrelevant. They wrote neat lines through ships that had delighted in writing messy lines through weaker civilizations. When the crown of ashes finally shuddered, it was not from a hit but from the absence of fleet, the way a harbor feels when the tide sprints out. Icons collapsed into debris fields, call signs went silent with an almost professional neatness. Time, Sterling said. The countdown reached 0. The universe held still as if humoring the number, and then a last thread of slugs finished their errands. The noise cut off abruptly. In the widening quiet, Erix realized that he was hearing only his own crew breathing. A third of them were already dead but had not fallen yet. He ordered surrender, the syllables tasting like metal. The Aurelian language lacked a graceful grammar for conceding to primitives. They would have to invent one later. Humans had already invented the weapons. Escape pods flickered from ruptured hulls. Searchlights from human rescue craft stitched cones through the wreckage, tagging pods with friendly tethers. A medical corvette shouldered alongside the crown of ashes and threw a soft line. The first human aboard apologized, actually apologized, for the adhesive on the splint she slid under Erix's left arm. He tried to spit. The taste of reactor coolant made the gesture undignified. He expected airless cells and anesthetic executions. Instead, he woke in a ship that smelled of coffee and hot electronics, his injuries neatly stitched by people who apologized for the sting of antiseptics. The hull plaque read TCV Meridian. On the wall opposite his bed was a printed sign. Do not apologize for winning. Do apologize for waste. The nurse noticed him reading. We try to keep the second line bigger, she said, and checked his pulse like he was an algebra problem worth solving. Admiral Sterling met Erix without guards. Her uniform held no medals. They were stitched into the way she stood. Beside her, Dr. Arjun Patel wheeled a terminal over and began with kindness. We would like to understand your shields. You have already passed through them, Erix rasped. Understanding seems redundant. "It is the courtesy of engineers," Patel said, "and courtesies help wars end." He laid out diagrams not as a boast but as a bridge, rails nested in basalt, superconducting rings fed by fusion barges disguised as cargo haulers, satellites with masking panels that looked like weather vanes. "You taught your fleets to fear light," he said. "We taught our factories to accelerate cricket bat physics." Erix rolled the word cricket around his throat and failed to find a referent. Sterling solved it by summary. "Our ancestors are very good at hitting small things very hard." "Your scouts saw no unification," Erix said. "They saw your arguments." "They did," Sterling replied, "but they did not see our protocols. Red silence is one of them." She keyed a clip. On the screen, the human globe dimmed along its fiber nerves. Government chatter compressed to numerals. Broadcasts fell to a hum. Airports became chessboards. Fleets blurred into the anonymous ocean. When an external threat crosses certain thresholds, mass, vector, intent, a set of automatic treaties executes. Communications constrain. Authority collapses upward. Training that was boring finally earns its paycheck. Boring. "Nothing is more boring than practicing unity you may never need," Sterling said. "Until you need it. Then boredom is a weapon." Patel toggled to math that even an Aurelian could respect. Estimated shield attenuation curves versus projectile density. Track prediction horizons. Logistics graphs that showed how you could hide a war machine under the statistics of 1,000 civilian supply chains. He put up procurement spreadsheets with line items that read like asphalt and storm drains, but were, in fact, cryo bearings and coil casings. There was elegance here, and something like mercy. "We prefer deterrence," Patel said. "But deterrence is a kind of theater. Sometimes the curtain must rise." "You killed 50,000 of my sailors," Erix said, surprising himself with the ache in the count. Sterling did not flinch. "You chose their theater. We closed it early." Then softer, "We also retrieved as many as we could." Images flashed of lifeboat corridors, of humans tugging terrified Aurelians into med bays, of translators cobbled from open-source code and desperate politeness. An orderly paused the clip when a medic offered a frightened Aurelian child a bright sticker shaped like a star. "We ran out," the orderly said. "We will print more." "What will you do with us?" "Send you home," Sterling said. "With a message and with medicine. Tell your Senate the Commonwealth exists, not as a flag that wants more fabric, but as a promise to our children that slavers do not get profitable decades." "Commonwealth," Erix repeated. "A new empire with a good mood." "A network with boundaries," Sterling countered. "We trade, we teach, we do not kneel." She glanced at the printed sign on the wall. "We apologize for waste." The recording they gave him to take home was not a triumph reel. It was an instruction manual wrapped around a warning. Demonstration footage of slugs passing through shields, annotated with humane pauses. Explanations of rescue corridors that could be opened if future admirals surrendered early. Technical envelopes that were careful enough to terrify but vague enough to avoid proliferation. They wanted fear. They refused panic. The closing page read, "If you come hungry for treaties." Sterling scrolled further. A timeline, almost offensive in its tidiness. At H+0014, heads of state on a secure mesh executed Unity protocols last amended a decade earlier after a comet near miss. At H+0231, independent commands relinquished fire authority to a joint grid. At H+0600, every launcher on Earth, national, private, or conveniently deniable, sang from one book. We argue loudly, she said, but we plan quietly. On the day Erix departed, Sterling walked him to the airlock. Your empire thinks different means lesser, she said. We are different, not lesser. He considered the hook of those words and the way they fit the throat. My Senate will mass a fleet. Sterling's smile never reached cruelty. Then we will mass a lesson. She offered her hand, a human custom. Erix hesitated, then matched it with the Aurelian gesture of respectful claw curl. Two anatomies solved the problem of contact without injury. Engineers, after all. 6 months renamed half the map. Worlds that had once answered to Aurelian tax ships voted themselves back into older names that tasted like home. The Commonwealth did not plant governors. It signed defense compacts, shipped antibiotics and encryption, sent teachers instead of tribunes. Erix, stripped of rank by an empire insulted by survival, accepted a new commission he had not expected, liaison to the enemy that had saved his life. On the TCV anchorage, Captain Lee Ocampo walked him along a spine of glass where the stars looked close enough to fog with his breath. 48, she said, tapping a list of liberated systems. 52, Erix corrected without thinking. It is the right number for a lesson. He learned the Commonwealth's religion, if it had one, competence with a choir of contrition. Engineers who could recite casualty figures to the digit but baked bread for evacuees with the same precision. Marines who joked in the corridor and cried in the cargo bay after seeing a mine camp converted into a school. Mercy here was not weakness. It was policy tuned by statistics. News arrived the way bad weather does. First a smell, then a pressure change, then the window speaking in rain. Recon nets stitched with Aurelian frequencies reported a new formation coalescing near the rim. 400 hulls under War Marshal Karsus, a man who collected surrenders like cufflinks. Operation Restoration, they named it, the petty romance of men who believed the past could be dragged by the hair into the present. Ocampo brought up the mobilization overlay. Iron Chorus, she said. Symbols bloomed across friendly space, yard doors rolling open, allied militias jumping in on schedule, siege platforms uncapping longer-legged versions of the slugs that had cleaned LEO in an afternoon. The plan was not to hold Earth. It was to make every approach to Earth into a lecture hall with very expensive chalk. Your people could conquer the rim and call it preventative ethics, Erix said, testing for the edge of their restraint. We could, Ocampo agreed. But empire is a maintenance problem we do not want. We prefer anchors, places you can tie to in a storm. Arcs between anchors make trade. That's harder to bomb than a flag. She pointed to a cluster of beacons lighting up around a market moon that had once been a slave brokerage. See, anchor, now watch the arc. A convoy route brightened between 3 systems like a constellation deciding to become a sentence. They watched as a convoy of hospital ships slid past, paint still wet, the kind of white that means do not shoot in 100 languages. Ocampo nodded toward them. This is the other half of Iron Chorus. If Karsus breaks, we must catch what falls. In a briefing with Allied envoys, Sterling appeared again, older by a handful of sleepless hours, which is the human way of measuring wars. We will meet them at the lines we have drawn, she said. We will teach until they stop learning the wrong lessons. She detailed corridors for surrender, time-on-target windows measured in harmonies, jammer constellations that could convince an angry admiral that the emptiest place in space was crowded with terrible options. Irix remembered a young sensor tech on the Crown of Ashes who had traced human tracks with the awe usually reserved for comets. He wondered if she had lived long enough to see a rescue corridor. He hoped she had. He hoped the math of rescue could someday be easier than the math of killing. Beside the lectern, a clock began to count up from 0, not down, measuring not how little time an enemy had left, but how much time the Commonwealth intended to invest. The number ticked past 52 and kept going. Somewhere beyond the glass spine, construction drones swung a new battery into place. Optics turned toward the rim, not with hunger, but with attention. Ocampo's comms officer slid a slate across the table. The first elements of Karsus's fleet had crossed a beacon line and failed to announce themselves. "They will test your chorus," Irix said. "They will help us tune it," Ocampo replied and smiled a tired engineer's smile. Irix squared his shoulders and took his seat at the liaison console. He would translate. He would testify. He would, if luck permitted, help a war marshal choose the math that left more children alive. The era of quick victories was over. The era of careful ones had to begin. Engines across the task force warmed in sympathetic vibration, a hum that settled behind the breastbone like resolve. In the dark beyond the rim, 400 hulls arranged themselves into old certainties. In the light within, a different certainty gathered. That lessons, given plainly, could change the syllabus of a galaxy. War Marshal Karsus adored large numbers in the way priests adore verses. 400 hulls, 12 dread spearheads, 47 auxiliary tenders converted into launch cradles. He recited the totals aloud so his captains could hear destiny as arithmetic. When news of Cathvar's destruction reached his dais, he dismissed it with the ease of a man who had never lost a bet. 50 ships do not vanish in under a minute. Shields do not fail to throne metal. Primitives do not conjure admirals out of committee meetings. Trickery, he said, and the word was a salve. They staged an ambush to flatter themselves. He would answer with weight. He did not lack believers. Veterans with scarred mandibles nodded through his briefings, seeing a story they already knew, an empire reminded of itself. Younger officers smiled with the zeal of people who had only studied maps of victory. The fleet that coalesced around Karsus's flagship looked like an argument against uncertainty. The Senate, which had been frightened by Earth without admitting it, stopped fidgeting when the tracker board showed all those green icons moving together. Green meant order. Order was a lullaby. Behind the swagger, friction accumulated like frost. Navigational buoys along the rim reported latency, jitters the technicians could not reproduce on the bench. Long-haul convoys arrived on time but lighter, as if the void had quietly taxed them by a few crates. Jammer trusses burned out in patterned clusters, like a disease choosing its organs. Signals officers swore human bands were polluted with nonsense. Children's songs, shopping lists, weather bulletins, until a junior tech noticed the nonsense repeated every 6 minutes with clockmaker precision. "Noise, sir," his supervisor insisted. The tech did not answer. He was tapping the pattern with his finger and quietly matching it to his pulse. Karsus organized his host as a spear because spears had won him worlds. He placed his most obedient captains along the shaft and reserved the spearhead for himself. The plan was ritual. Jump to the frontier beacons. jam everything that blinks, punch a corridor with converging fire, flood it with boarding barges, and anchor an occupation lattice before the humans could harmonize their bickering governments. Every sentence ended with the same unspoken clause, like always. The first jump went clean, the second, ragged. On the third, a dozen ships came out crooked by a hair's breadth, enough to embarrass navigators and insult their software. Scans reported nothing living ahead, only a pasture of civilian containers drifting on legal orbits. Karsus ordered a contemptuous burn straight through them. The containers did not explode. They unfolded. It was an elegant betrayal of categories. Boxes yawned into launch rails. Harmless tumble stabilized into precise attitude. What had been cargo became choir, a constellation of cheap machines that had waited months for a single beat and snapped into time with the calm of a metronome. From worlds behind the line, deep batteries woke, their power hidden under industrial graphs and infrastructure budgets. A neutrino pulse swept the battle space. One click, no louder than a heartbeat, and everything that wore the Commonwealth's flag fell into a measure Karsus had never learned to read. The human message arrived a breath later, translated into Aurelian with irritating clarity. You are entering managed space. Declare intent or accept guidance to a surrender corridor. It was not a taunt. It sounded like an air traffic controller's kindness before a storm. Karsus cut the channel with a flick of anger. Guidance is for the guided, he said to his bridge, and signaled the spearhead to accelerate. Guidance did not ask permission. Invisible fences bloomed where emptiness had been. Not mines, no heat signatures, no plasma cough, just geometry enforced by projectiles too fast for pride. Slugs stitched lanes into the dark, lanes that punished deviation and left mercy down the center. Captains veered in reflex and found themselves rebound back toward the corridors like fish corrected by a river. The spear reacted like spears do when pressed to curve. It cracked. What the scouts had logged as weather towers on moons now kicked their foundations open and sang rails. What the scouts had called agricultural silos wrote straight lines into space. What the scouts had laughed off as trash satellites revealed recoil trusses and cold logic. An empire that had tuned its fear to light found itself dying to mass. And yet, around the dying, small craft darted with absurd purpose. Rescue skiffs, already burning toward pods that had not yet launched. Karsus grinned at the first loss like a man who had finally found the game. They cannot kill us all, he said, a vow and a dare. He stacked numbers against the corridors and prepared to feed them forward until the math broke. He believed, as empires do, that courage multiplied behind him would negate intelligence ahead of him. He did not yet understand that the weapon waiting for him was not merely velocity. It was rhythm. He paced the length of his bridge, savoring the ritual of pointing at constellations and naming them targets. This line is the throat, he said, tapping a thin chain of beacons humans had leased to merchants. Cut it, and they choke. His navigator did not correct him, that those beacons now pulsed on independent power schedules his software could not predict, that their clocks had shifted to match an unseen conductor. Pride turned data into wallpaper. Even so, several officers exchanged the quick, nervous glance of people who know the room is tilting but cannot admit which way. The neutrino beat ticked again. Somewhere, something enormous inhaled. Later, historians would bracket the battles beginning with timestamps and diagrams, but for those inside it, the iron chorus started as a sensation in the ribs. A soft pulse ticked through the fleet nets of the Commonwealth and its allies, a neutrino-tattooed click that arrived everywhere at almost the same moment. Gun captains matched their breathing to it without being told. Rail batteries cycled not on command but on time. The pulse did not tell ships what to do, it told them when to be themselves together. On plots rendered for anxious envoys, the opening bars looked merciful. Rail slugs traced scaffolds rather than kills, riding bright fences through the dark. Particle beams lanced engines instead of reactors, carving away pursuit without forcing funerals. Drones disguised as common cargo slid from harmless orbits and unrolled reflector kites that confused Aurelian scopes into seeing crowds where there were corridors. On open bands, a woman's voice, Admiral Sterling, spoke as if explaining a school drill. Lay down arms. Identify. Proceed down the corridor marked for your vector. We will retrieve you. Karsus took the mercy as mockery. He collapsed his spear into a denser wedge and dove for the apparent seam between two human task groups. The chorus changed keys. Where one beat had ruled, three interlocked: rail cadence, beam counterpoint, decoy syncopation. It was not complexity for its own sake. It was choreography designed to make a heavy mind step on its own toes. Aurelian captains who prided themselves on crisp doctrine found their doctrine nudged 5 seconds off and died inside the offset. 50 hulls broke in the first minute, clean punctures, motors stilled, crews bleeding but alive. Human rescue skiffs dashed after the violence like medics running onto a field, lashing lifeboats, cutting open jammed hatches with tools that glowed instead of screamed. Karsus forced himself not to watch the rescues. He ordered saturation. The wedge would throw bodies at a wall until the wall remembered it was supposed to bow. The wall sang instead. Batteries on moons and towers and barges embedded in shipping lanes fired to a measure that cared nothing for Karsus's personal courage. When he throttled up, the measure shortened. When he vectored wide, it broadened and met him there. When he jammed, the pulse dove into frequencies he had not paid to monitor because no one had ever needed them. Around him, his best captains tried improvisation, that forbidden sport, and found the Commonwealth waiting at the end of every clever turn with the patience of infrastructure. In a rare quiet breath, Erix listened to a channel the humans had left unencrypted on purpose. It was a logistics net, banal on its face. Convoy 9, you are clear through the arc. Anchor Delta reports fuel at 62%. Schoolship Peary, your schedule holds. Children will meet librarians on arrival. It was absurd to hear library timetables walking alongside kinetic salvo plots. It was also the point. The chorus did not exist to display virtuosity. It existed so life could keep ordinary appointments while predators were being discouraged. Karsus finally drew blood. A human destroyer held its ground too long to shield a gaggle of evacuating auxiliaries and took a beam like a harpoon. The bridge camera spun, caught a glimpse of a lieutenant laughing in disbelief at being alive, then went black. The chorus missed a beat. For 3 knife hearts of time, its timing fell all the way down to grief. Then the pulse returned thicker, as if anger had mass that could be added to a metronome. Lay down, Sterling said again. We will catch you. The line did not change because the music had darkened. It stayed the line because the strategy was the same. Kill only as needed. Disable whenever possible. Leave room for a future that isn't more killing. The second movement unfolded farther from Earth than any prior human battle, at distances where the Empire had always felt safe. Commonwealth yards had been laying pipe there for years, fueling pods tucked into Trojan points, repair sleds nested inside tourist stations, cold sleep bunkers for evacuees hidden behind museums that taught children the names of comets. When the chorus called, all of it stood up, a tug that had once hauled or swung a derelict out of a kill lane. A ferry changed its signage to rescue and did not change its captain. A lamp that had always illuminated a memorial turned its lens upward and became a guide star. The ordinary had been cultivated for exactly this day. Karsus tried a feint he had loved since academy days. Send a sacrificial screen to draw attention, then knife through with fast battle gliders. The screen died as expected. The knife met a door that had not been there a second before. A lattice of microsats woke, each no bigger than a helmet, each carrying one job, a single coil, a single lens, a single logic gate, and together they behaved like a warship the size of a constellation. The gliders plowed into geometry and came apart in dignified silence. Karsus raged and promised the Senate a new plan. The chorus, indifferent to plans, kept time. The iron chorus lasted hours by the clocks that make bureaucrats happy and soldiers old. It had crescendos and lulls, soloists and sections, mistakes and recoveries. What it did not have was the old Aurelian grammar of decisive duel. Karsus could not find a single throat to cut to make the body fall. Every time he carved a gap, Commonwealth fire did not race to fill it in panic. It descended like rain, distributed, ordinary, inevitable. Some Aurelian captains proved quicker than their doctrine. They ordered shields down to stop wasting glow against kinetics and bared armor to vacuum, and were cut by beams that shields, had they lived, might have at least smeared into prettier scars. Others scattered into skirmish knots, only to meet a targeting lattice that loved dispersion the way a teacher loves columns of numbers. A few tried to hide in the shadow of their own wrecks. Rescue skiffs found them first and left them tagged for tugs with polite beacons. Even surrender was being organized for them, which offended those still uninjured enough to be proud. Eryx translated requests for terms, curses for gods, and the thin voices of midshippers who had never said anything interesting to anyone and were suddenly speaking to history. Between relays he watched Sterling's staff work. No chest thumping, no victory roars. Only relentless correction. Shift cadenza west 6 degrees, a gunnery chief murmured. Beam 3 trim 2% for turbulence. Rescue 14, you are clear into grid Aleph, watch for scuttle spikes. It looked he marveled and hated the marvel, like a hospital conducting a storm, not a battle being enjoyed. At minute 37, Karsus broke into the common band with a sermon. You cannot hold this shape, he snarled. Your unity is a fever. It will break. The Senate will return, and you will drown in what you are. He was not pleading for his fleet. He was pleading for the comfort of inevitability. Sterling did not answer with adjectives. She pasted data across the band. A week of traffic from a liberated world whose name the Empire had not bothered to pronounce. Trade packets queuing without bribes. A school calendar, a heater repair request submitted by a farmer and completed by a bored teenager earning civic credit. We argue, she said. We fatigue, we fail, then we try again. That is the rhythm. You mistake struggle for fracture. For us, struggle is practice. The chorus prepared its coda. Guns reset to a disabling tune. Slugs took wrists instead of throats. Engines, gimbal locks, weapon muzzles, coolant throats. Particle beams wrote tidy rectangles where broad slashes would have left mass graves. Scuttle charges blinked online, and rescue drones bit them off, small metal dogs chewing fuses. When Karsus finally lost his flagship, it was not to a romantic reactor breach. It was to an unglamorous cut that left the hull intact and the war marshal breathing and very finished. Silence followed, not triumphant but full, like the breath the galaxy had been holding since it learned it was crowded. Eric's, throat raw, asked the question the remnant bands were burbling around. Why refuse to kill when killing would be easier? Sterling considered him as if measuring whether the answer would fit in words. Because we are not only making enemies stop, she said. We are making stories start. Martyrs get remembered by the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Survivors can testify. We prefer testimony. Boarding teams, yes, boarding in the middle of a star battle, punched across to crippled Aurelian hulls with medics welded to their backs. They secured magazines, neutralized panicked officers, and opened corridors to space so smoke could flee. They handed out water packs and triage tags that chimed when a patient slipped. A captured gunnery chief stared at a human petty officer working an extinguisher and asked, in bewildered sincerity, why? The petty officer, bruised and grinning, shouted back over the hiss, because there are better ways to recruit allies than making funerals. The surrender corridors brightened on command, not merely as vectors but as promises. Aurelian crews tested them with lifeboats first, then with whole frigates limping on auxiliary power. The corridors held. On the far end, rescue tenders arrived with translation headsets and hot broth. A chaplain of no stated faith offered to listen to oaths that no one would be allowed to keep anymore. On one frequency, an Aurelian captain wept like a storm. I was told the Commonwealth wanted our humiliation, he said. The reply came from a junior ensign whose badge still squeaked. No, sir. We want your witnesses. Karsus did not get a martyr's exit. He got a stretcher. The last note of his fleet was a chorus of transponders switching from hostile to recovering. The Commonwealth did not cheer. It began an audit. Weeks later, under a sky that had once been a tax schedule, a plaza filled with voices that were learning the permission to be loud. The system of Vera voted to join the Commonwealth, and the word join meant something precise. Not kneeling, not annexing, not swapping one anthem for another, but agreeing to arcs and anchors, to protection compacts, trade corridors, and shared courts that judged slavers with the boredom of traffic judges. Banners hung in half a dozen alphabets. On each the same 3 lines: we do not kneel, we do not enslave, we remember. Eric's, no longer war marshal, no longer even officer, took the lectern allotted to the one who had been enemy and was now necessary. He spoke carefully, borrowing human syllables where Aurelian ones bruised. I was catechized in inevitability. Shields defeat rocks. Unity dissolves. Conquest civilizes. In 52 seconds, those catechisms failed their exams. In the months after, I watched engineers convert prisons to clinics and logisticians route fuel to heaters instead of harvesters of pain. I do not know your songs yet, but I know your timing. He tapped the podium once, a little offbeat, and the crowd answered with a laugh that sounded like forgiveness rehearsing itself. Around the square, screens carried feeds from worlds learning the same tune at different tempos. A mining moon reopened under co-op law. A market hub posted new rules. No flesh sale, no debt indentures, no private navies. Violators would be fined in cargo and shamed in public, which turned out to be a currency tyrants hated to spend. Library ships in orbit accepted long lines of children and pirates alike. It looked, infuriatingly and wonderfully, like maintenance. Sterling spoke last, not because she loved the podium, but because everyone else needed her calendar. She did not promise perpetual victory. She promised budgets, more hospital tonnage, more inspectors who can tell the difference between a weather tower and a gun that's pretending, more translators, more patient teachers. We will keep the chorus tuned because predators test fences, but the point of the fence is the garden. Reporters, newly brave, asked if Earth would now rule. Sterling shook her head. "Ruling is expensive and fragile," she said. "We prefer agreements. If someone insists on crowns, they can wear them in private." She stepped back to give the floor to a Veyron baker whose shop had survived 2 occupations by changing its name and never its recipe. The woman announced extended hours. The crowd cheered like a fleet had been commissioned, which in a way it had, a fleet of mornings with bread. In a quieter hall, Erix and a group of former Aurelian officers met with Commonwealth engineers. They spoke warranties, not vengeance. How long rescue beacons would be maintained, what it cost to keep surrender corridors lit, how to audit a defense packed for creep. The engineers passed around a single sheet of paper that looked like a manifesto and was actually a service-level agreement. Erix ran a claw down the clause that required annual public drills in which citizens practiced ignoring demagogues. He laughed despite himself. "You drill ignoring." An engineer shrugged. "Muscle memory." That night, aboard the flagship Horizon, the glass spine looked out upon the work of a society choosing its verbs. Drones lifted new arrays into place, some that listened for threats, some that amplified music from a park below. A logistics net hummed with the sacred profanities of port schedulers. Somewhere in the dark, a remnant raid tried a border and found it uninteresting. The fence hummed. The garden did not look up. Erix pressed his palm to the glass and felt in his bones the same pulse that had once terrified his fleet. It no longer sounded like a countdown. It sounded like a metronome for construction. He whispered the number that had started the new calendar, 52. Then, like an engineer cruel to nostalgia, he began to count up. The Terran Commonwealth was not flawless. It would argue, it would fatigue. It would, inevitably, fail and repair. But it had chosen its mathematics and printed them on signs a nurse could read at 3 a.m. Do not apologize for winning. Do apologize for waste. It had chosen its anthem too, a song that enemies could hear and still decide to live. The galaxy would not mistake Earth for defenseless again. With luck, it would not mistake mercy for weakness either.